trusted my childhood friend with family business, only to discover he was stealing clients and lying to investors, and when I confronted him, he threatened to ruin my reputation, leaving me alone to rebuild everything from scratch overnight. I was 27 when I realized that trust can destroy you faster than ever can betrayal. My name is Ethan Cole, and I'm from a small town in Ohio called Maple Ridge, where people wave off porches and believe everyone tells the truth. My father, David Cole, started our family business 30 years ago with just a pickup truck and the promise that he'd never owe anyone a dime. When he passed away 5 years ago, that vow was mine. I'd worked for him since the age of 16, how to interpret blueprints before I was allowed to drive. So when my turn came, I was prepared. What I didn't know was that the person who would tear it all down wasn't a stranger or a competitor. It was my childhood best friend, Caleb Harris. Caleb and I grew up 3 houses apart. We'd toss a ball around in the summer, get in trouble for pitching rocks on the train tracks, stay up late talking about how we both would be famous someday. He was one of those guys who could talk his way out or into a situation. Always had that smirk on his face, always said the right thing to say. I was more subdued, more focused on work, but I trusted him like a brother. When my dad died, he was one of the few who came every day, helped me get the papers in place, dealt with contractors, even sat with my mom while she couldn't stop sobbing. So when I selected him as my business partner, it didn't even feel like a gamble. It felt like family. I remember the Friday morning I signed the partnership papers. The air was hot, with the smell of sawdust from the shop next door still hanging. Caleb arrived with coffee, smiling as if he'd already been the boss. "We're gonna take this company national, Ethan," he said, banging his cup against mine. I smiled and told him we'd start by surviving tax season first. But that was the thing about Caleb. He always thought bigger, faster, louder. He needed to make his moves before he thought twice about it, and I admired that, at least back then. The first year was incredible. He brought on new clients, did some marketing, even had a new logo designed. I oversaw the work sites, the crews, the budgeting. We were a good team. Then things started to shift. It was sneaky initially. Overdue bills, past due payments, odd conversations with clients who thought they'd already paid. I wrote it off as accounting errors. We were growing rapidly, so things occur. But then our biggest client, Anderson Realty, called to ask why we had double billed them for the same project. I reviewed the books myself, and that's when the knot formed in my stomach. The numbers didn't balance, not even close. That night, I rifled through all the files Caleb had handled for the past 6 months. Thousands of dollars were missing. Payments were redirected. I found fake invoices under unknown company names. The really creepy part? He'd signed them with my father's old initials, DC. I lay awake all night. My hands shook so hard I could barely grip my phone. I phoned Caleb. Nothing. I texted him. Nothing. He finally showed up the next day. Same old thing. Smiling. Laughing. I asked him directly, "Caleb, why on earth do we have fake invoices in our system?" He didn't blink. He said, "Ethan, you're thinking too much. I've got it handled." That was what I remembered. I've got it handled. As if I were some restless kid who had no idea about business. But I did. I knew precisely. He was stealing from me. I said nothing to my mom, to anyone. I wanted evidence first, so I started sneaking around, monitoring everything. Every client, every payment, every call. Within 2 weeks, I had enough evidence to kill him. He'd been routing the money through shell companies and telling them they were subcontractors. And worse, he'd been meeting with investors secretly and informing them I was allowing the business to spiral out of control, painting me as the weak point. I was stunned, as if someone had sucked the air from my lungs. I couldn't eat, couldn't think. All those memories of our friendship that I'd banked, every baseball game, every late-night discussion, it all seemed fabricated now, as if he'd been studying from me his whole life just to learn how to stab me in the correct way. When I finally went up to him, it was in the office. A Wednesday, late in the afternoon. The crew had left, sun filtering through the blinds in that orange glow that makes everything feel heavier. I laid out the papers on the table and said, "You've been stealing from me, Caleb." He laughed, actually laughed, then said, "You really think anyone's going to believe this? You don't even have the experience to run this company without me." I was so enraged that I wanted to hit him at that moment, but I didn't. I just told him to get out, that I'd call the police if he came back. He moved in close, his voice low. "Publicize this, Ethan, and I'll ruin you. Everybody in town thinks you are in over your head. I'll inform them about your dad owing people money. You falsified the numbers. You'll lose everything." And for that moment, I wanted to believe him. I waited in my truck outside the office that evening for 2 hours. The neon sign flashed on and off, warping in the windshield. I thought of my dad, how he'd begun from nothing, how he'd be so proud when I became a contractor. And I thought of Caleb, the kid who used to sneak me extra fries at the diner after school. How had we arrived here? How had friendship come to this? Caleb had frozen me out of the bank account and company email by morning. He acted fast. Sent emails to clients saying that I was taking a break due to mental health reasons. Some of them believed him, others did not. I went to the office and found that the locks had been modified. The sign on the door was still Cole Construction, but it didn't belong to me anymore. It felt taken. Everything my dad worked for, everything I had accumulated, lost in one night. I called the police and they told me it was a civil matter. I called the bank and they told me Caleb was joint owner with all the authority to collect the money. I called our lawyer and he told me it would take months to sort out, maybe longer. I just sat there, silently, staring at the papers spread out on my kitchen table. My whole life was written out on those pages, and at the top of every paper, right under my father's name, was Caleb's signature. That's when it struck me. I wasn't angry. I was ashamed. Ashamed that I trusted him. Ashamed that I didn't see it. Ashamed that I let my dad's memory be besmirched by the man whom I once called brother. But underneath all that shame, there was something else. Something more sharp. The imperative to rebuild. Not for vengeance. For my dad. For me. For the oath I swore. The first few weeks after Caleb's theft of everything were a blur. I'd rise every morning before sunrise as I always had due to habit, but there was nowhere to go. No crews to command, no office to open. I'd sit at my kitchen table staring at a pile of bills and a stale cup of coffee, and I'd wonder how in the world my world had been turned upside down in one night. I tried calling some of our clients, informing them of what was occurring, but half of them had already been told I was taking time off. Caleb had poisoned all our relationships before I could even be aware that this was happening. I remember one morning my mom came by with a box of my dad's retired equipment. She said to me, "Your dad would want you to keep working, Ethan." I glared at that creaky tape measure and busted level and my chest tightened. "I don't even have a company left, Mom," she simply said. "Then start a new one." Simple words, but they fell on me like a gauntlet. I had no capital, reputation, or support, but I did have a name, and I was not about to let Caleb bury it in a grave. So I started small, very small. Myself, my father's old pickup, and two men who had worked for us before Caleb came along. Miguel, mid-30s, quiet but dependable, and Travis, 21, still wet behind the ears but as faithful as a dog. We fixed porches, small roofing jobs, even painted fences just to keep our heads above water. I couldn't refer to it as the company name anymore since Caleb had provided paperwork claiming he owned it free and clear. So I called this one Iron Ridge Construction. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. There was hardly any money. Some weeks I barely broke even. I sold my old dirt bike, my TV, even some of my dad's equipment. Every night I'd go over numbers on a scrap of paper because I couldn't afford to purchase accounting software. It was humiliating, kind of, but it did leave me hungry. Caleb might have stolen the business, but he couldn't steal what I'd learned. Then, about a month or so after that, I received a call from one of our former customers, Mrs. Avery, a real estate agent we'd built decks for several years earlier. She called me to vent that Caleb had used her deposit to remodel and then skipped out. I told her the truth. Caleb and I were no longer business partners, and maybe she would not get her money back. She took a breath and said, "I don't care about the money. I care about the work. Can you do it?" That one question changed everything. I said yes before I could think it through. That stint was 3 weeks, and it was terrible. We worked in the rain or the sun, through broken tools, through nights so cold our fingers became ice. But once completed, it was perfect. She posted pictures on the web, labeled my new business, and I was getting calls within a week. The news traveled fast in Maple Ridge. People around here love underdogs. They appreciate tales of someone getting back on their feet. But just as it was taking off, Caleb returned. I got a letter one afternoon, an official notice of cease and desist, and it charged me with abusing company property and client lists illegally. I had to laugh. I hadn't had access to a damn thing. I phoned the number on the notice and his lawyer answered. "Mr. Harris feels you're damaging his reputation by contacting former clients," he told me. I told him, "He's the one who stole from them." The man didn't smile. He just replied, "We'll see you in court." The prospect of court sent a shiver down my spine, not because I was guilty, but because Caleb had money, lawyers, connections. He could drag it out till I cracked. But I also knew something about Caleb. He despised being caught out. So I gathered everything I had, every message, every transaction record I'd copied before losing access. Then I met with Laura Bennett, a local attorney in her early 40s who'd known my dad. She read through the documents and said, "This isn't just a business dispute, Ethan. It's fraud. You've got a case. Hearing that felt like oxygen after drowning. It took months spent sitting in courtrooms listening to Caleb's attorney spin false stories. Months spent watching Caleb dress up in expensive suits like he was still the hero. Every now and then, someone in the crowd would be hushed and trying to figure out who to believe. My head was down. Let the facts speak for themselves. The judge issued a full audit finally, and when they got back to them, Caleb's whole facade crumbled. The figures didn't lie. He'd stolen over $200,000 through shell firms and altered contracts. The day the verdict was announced, I was hoping to feel released, but what I felt was empty. Caleb got away with jail through a plea bargain, but the firm was shut down. That means everything, equipment, assets, real estate, was liquidated. I got nothing for my troubles, but my name vindicated. I remember walking out of that courthouse feeling the sun on my face and thinking, so that's it. I did not win. I simply stopped losing. After the case ended, Caleb disappeared. It was said he went to another state, maybe Florida, maybe Texas, depending on who you asked. I didn't care then. I was done running after ghosts. I focused on repairing. I took every dollar I'd earned and put it back into Iron Ridge, got new equipment, hired a few more workers, rented a small office space downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was progress. Then something strange started happening. Clients I'd never met began calling. Others informed me they'd heard I brought down an unscrupulous partner. Others spoke of how much they'd respected the fact that I'd kept my word even when I'd lost everything. It was odd, being envied for surviving. But maybe that's what rebuilding involves, converting pain into proof that you didn't give up. There were still nights, though, when rage came again. Sleepless nights replaying in my mind that moment in the office, Caleb's words ringing in my ear, "I'll ruin you." Deep down, I still wanted him to fall, not get away with it. But somewhere else inside me, the voice that sounded like my dad was saying, bitterness doesn't build. Work does. One evening, driving home from a long day in the field, I drove past our old office building. The sign came down, the building empty. For sale in the window. I stood there for a moment. I thought about all that had started and stopped inside the building. I thought about all the people who'd walked through its doors. My dad, my mom, me, Caleb. And for the first time, I didn't despise. I was just exhausted. I rolled down the window, took a deep breath, and exhaled lightly. I'm still here. That was enough. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need an apology. All I needed was to keep building, because that's what my father did. Undefined. And that's what I'd keep doing, project by project, until Iron Ridge meant something. It was a year before I felt like myself once more. Iron Ridge Construction wasn't simply scraping by, it was growing. We employed 10 people, had a steady list of contracts, and clients that actually trusted me. Every nail I hammered, every wall I built, was part of my life being rebuilt. I didn't flinch when I heard Caleb's name. The rest of the town had moved on from the drama, or maybe they'd just forgotten. But I hadn't. Not really. Some wounds close over on the outside, but on the inside, they still burn. So when I got that out of the blue call from a company in Cincinnati, it hit me harder than I expected. The man said his name was Mark Jensen, director of operations for a large development firm. He said, "We've heard good things about Iron Ridge, Mr. Cole. We're looking for a contractor who can do integrity as well as quality." I almost laughed when he used the word integrity. I didn't know whether to be proud or haunted. But a job was a job, and this one was big. 5 custom homes in a new housing development. The kind of deal that could set us up for years. I told him I was in. 2 weeks later, I drove to Cincinnati to sign papers. The office was new, neat, glass everywhere. Mark's handshake was firm, said he'd been sent by one of my old clients. We talked for an hour, and I left with the impression that things were finally going to turn around. But then, just as I was about to leave, I saw a figure step out of one of the meeting rooms along the hall. Caleb. He froze too. Neither of us spoke for a moment. He was older, thinner, but still had that smug grin that made my blood boil. "Well, look who's here," he said. My first instinct was to turn and walk away, but my legs wouldn't move. Mark must have picked up on the tension because he looked between us and said, "You two know each other?" Caleb laughed. "Old business partners," he said, slapping me on the back like we were old friends. I brushed him off. "Not anymore," I said, and walked away before I said something I might regret. That night, I barely slept. I had no clue what he was doing there, whether he was working for them or trying to start something new. But the idea of him back in my orbit made my flesh crawl. I thought about backing out of the deal, but that would have been weakness, so I agreed to do it professionally. Stay in my lane, do the job, keep my distance. But of course, it was not that simple. 2 weeks into the project, Caleb started showing up at meetings. As it happened, he wasn't merely working there, he was the company's new project liaison, which meant I had to deal with him directly. The initial meeting was a disaster. He'd interrupt me halfway through a sentence, talk over my suggestions, question my cost projections as if I had no clue what I was doing. I bit my tongue both times. I needed that job. My crew needed it. But inside, I boiled. One day, after another marathon meeting filled with his niggling power plays, I approached him when he was alone in the parking lot. "You following me?" I asked. He sneered. "Take it easy, Ethan. It's business. You're not the only contractor in Ohio." I took a step closer. "If you try anything this time, anything, I'll make sure you never work in this state again." He laughed low in his throat. "You already tried that, remember?" Then he got in his car and left. From that day on, odd things started to happen again. Deliveries were delayed. Materials vanished. Inspectors showed up out of nowhere claiming I hadn't filed the right permits, even though I had. Someone was clearly attempting to make me look incompetent. My gut told me that it was Caleb. I had no evidence, but I could feel it. He was doing the exact same thing, just on a different field. I went to Mark about it, told him the situation truthfully, that I believed Caleb was sabotaging the project. Mark winced, but told me he couldn't take sides without evidence. "Those are the games of corporate politics," he said to me. "Keep it clean, keep it documented." So I did. I started taping calls, saving emails, documenting every delay. I got an anonymous email one night at about midnight. There was no message, just an attachment. It was a scanned purchase order with Caleb's signature. He had been sending shipments of materials to another location and having them charged to my account. My chest went cold. Here we go again. Same script, lies, manipulation, cover-ups. But this time, I was not naive. I had receipts. I waited for the next meeting. The whole team was present. Mark, 2 board members, Caleb attempting to play it cool. I laid out every document one by one, the fake purchase orders, the duplicate receipts, the recording of him saying adjusting numbers. The room went completely silent. Caleb's face went white. Mark asked him point blank, "Is this true?" Caleb stammered, said it was taken out of context. But it was over. They told him to leave the building immediately. I didn't even look at him as he walked past. I just stared at the table, my heart pounding. Mark pulled me aside after the meeting. "You just saved us from a huge lawsuit," he said. "We'll see that you're well rewarded." I nodded, but to be honest, money wasn't the problem. It was seeing him finally fall without my having to push. The company fired him within 24 hours. I heard afterward that he tried to sue them for unfair dismissal, but the proof was too concrete. I was told a couple of months later that he'd relocated out of Ohio altogether, maybe for good this time. I hoped so. The Cincinnati project went smoothly afterward. We finished all 5 homes ahead of time. The client even sent a handwritten thank you note, a novelty in these modern times. That letter is still on the wall in my office. Not because I am proud, but as a reminder of what it means to stand your ground. But when all the dust had settled, I couldn't help but feel that strange emptiness once again. It is curious how you can finally win, finally get justice, and not feel a sense of happiness. Because winning doesn't reverse the damage. It doesn't bring back the years, the trust, the peace you lost. It only leads to silence. Sometimes I catch myself sitting and wondering what would have been if I hadn't picked him as my partner that day, if I had followed my gut and not our history. But then I think of the men who now work under me, the clients who depend on me, the company I built from the ground up. Maybe the reason wasn't not to get betrayed. Maybe the lesson was how to rebuild when you're. That's what I tell my crew whenever they face setbacks. You can lose everything, I tell them, but you're never done unless you quit building. It's not just contractor talk, it's how I live today. 3 years have gone by since that final confrontation with Caleb. I'm 27 turning 28 now, and Iron Ridge Construction isn't a small town business anymore. We've got contracts in 3 states, 30 employees, and a reputation for honesty. Every morning when I walk into our new office, I still see my dad's old tape measure on the shelf. The same one my mom brought that day when it all fell apart. It's a reminder of where I started and what I paid to be here. Everybody wants to know how I kept going after I lost everything. I never have a good response. Truthfully, I didn't have some grand strategy. I simply woke up every morning and worked through the pain. One nail, one job, one long day at a time. Maybe that's all rebuilding is, just showing up when you don't want to. I occasionally wonder about Caleb. Not often, but often enough. I heard he moved to Georgia. Someone said he tried to start another business, but it didn't last. Supposedly, he got in trouble again. Something about the misappropriation of investor funds. When I first heard, I felt a flash of satisfaction. Then guilt. Then nothing. The thing is, I don't hate him anymore. I do not even pity him. He made his choice. I made mine, and maybe the worst I could ever do to him now is what I'm doing, living well. There is one moment that stays with me, however. A few months ago, I got an email from an address that I did not recognize. The subject was, "I owe you an apology." It was from Caleb. I stared at it for 10 minutes before I opened it. It was short. He apologized. Said he'd been desperate, insecure, jealous that I'd inherited something he never could. He said losing everything had shown him who he was. Then he said, "You were always the better man." I just couldn't handle it. I didn't respond. Not that I was intending to hold a grudge, but I had no clue what to say. What do you say to someone who destroyed your life and then decides to confess when it no longer makes any difference? I deleted the email and got back to work. Maybe that was my answer. Work grounds me. Always has. There is something honest about it. You can't fake a straight line in carpentry. You can't lie about whether a foundation is level. Either it will hold or it won't. That's the way I try to live nowadays. Construct things that will hold. Make promises that will stand. Last summer, I worked on a project that felt personal. A little library in the same neighborhood where my dad built the business. The city couldn't pay high-end contractors, so I offered to do it at cost. My crew thought I was crazy, but it wasn't a money thing. It was doing something for the community that raised me. Every time I passed that spot, I'd notice kids cutting through the park, families with pets, individuals living everyday lives, the kind of life I used to take for granted. I wanted to do something real for them, something honest. On the final day of the library project, I stood outside after everyone had left for the day. The late afternoon sun hit the building just right. Clean lines, fresh paint, everything spotless. I thought about my dad, about Caleb, about the 27-year-old me sitting in that kitchen surrounded by piles of unpaid bills and broken promises. I didn't recognize him anymore. He was still me, but smaller, lost, scared. I wanted to tell him it would be okay. That one day he'd build something even greater than what had been lost. But I guess he needed to go through it to believe it. That night, my mom called. She was driving by the library and saw the Iron Ridge sign out front. She was attempting to be proud, the kind of proud that makes your throat shut. "Your father would have liked this," she said. I smiled even though she couldn't see me. "I hope so," I said. She paused, then said, "He'd be proud that you learned to forgive." Forgive. That word stayed with me. I never said it out loud, but maybe she was right. Forgiveness isn't always about saying to the other person that they're forgiven. Sometimes it's just a decision that their actions no longer control your life, that they don't get to live rent-free in your head, that their chapter doesn't end yours. I returned to the office a week later, late one night after everyone had gone home. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you think too much. I sat down at my desk and pulled out my dad's old notebook, the one he'd written his first business plan in blue ink. The pages were yellow, corners torn. I flipped through until I found something he'd written years earlier. It said, "The day you stop learning, you stop building." I closed the notebook and just sat for a while. Maybe that's what all of this had been about. Learning. Learning who to trust, how to fail, how to start again. Learning that the people you love can devastate you, but you can still get yourself up again. I switched off lights individually as I moved through the office prior to leaving. The last thing I saw before I went out was the framed photograph of my original Iron Ridge crew, me, Travis, and Miguel, all smiling like idiots in front of a half-constructed roof. None of us knew what we were doing back then, but we had heart. That was all we needed. I shut the door, got in my truck, and headed home. The roads were bare, the air cool. Somewhere between the empty highway and open fields, I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Caleb, not at myself, not at how things ended. It had all shaped me into a person tougher. A person who finally understood what success actually looked like. It wasn't reputation or cash, it was peace. When I pulled into my driveway, I just sat there with the engine idling for a moment and listened to the wind in the trees. Then I turned off the ignition, got out, and looked up into the night sky. For the first time in a long time, everything was right where it was meant to be.